screen starts glowing and the film starts rolling. You wanna be knowing what you might be in for. So give the show a listen and find out what you're missing. Put yourself in position for the easy good score.
Hey listeners, welcome to a very special episode of The Goods, a film podcast. Brian, have we settled on a percentage of episodes that are very special?
It's probably like 79%. It probably gets said most times, at least when Dan is at the helm, which would put us closer to like 45% of the time. I think some of my episodes have been special. Even if it goes unsaid.
Even if you don't say it. I second that. This episode is special because we're talking about a director that I do not think that we have talked about on the podcast. And that is director Alfred Hitchcock. You might have heard of him. He is a English and American director. He started in England. He moved to Hollywood in, I think, the 40s. And then kind of made Hollywood movies for the rest of his career. Very influential and important director. We're going to talk a little bit about him. Also a special episode because we have our old friend back. It's Nate. Nate's back on the pod. He was here just like a month ago with, what was it, Good Will Hunting. And I said, I'd like to pick your brain about Rear Window at some point. Because I know that you have strong Hitchcock feelings, Nate, and that it would be interesting to hear your thoughts on this one. Because I had some kind of mixed feelings that I've kind of crystallized a little bit watching the movie again. But I'm kind of jumping the gun here. Let's go ahead and say hi to Nate. Nate, welcome back.
Hey, thanks. I'm choosing to believe this is a special episode solely because of my presence, and not because we're talking about one of the best movies ever made.
We ended up not needing to wait 164 episodes or whatever we said the last time.
That's right. Yeah, we had a big gap between our first two Nate appearances. And it was funny. We were talking about Good Will Hunting, and then at the end of the episode, I said we should schedule this soon. And you're like, well, let's just talk now. I want to talk Rear Window now. Let's go. And I was like, oh, I wish I was ready. I wish I had time. I appreciated your enthusiasm, though, and I'm glad that we were able to make it happen pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's one of those movies I can always talk about, and then I watched it again before this episode, so I'm even more ready.
I was wondering when was the last time before this week that we had watched it, because actually the first time I ever saw this movie was within the past year, so I was ready to go at the end of our last recording session. I was like, oh yeah, let's roll into it.
But same is true for me, actually. I had not seen Rear Window prior to probably like 3 months ago now, so very recently. There's a running joke in my household that my favorite show is movies. So when someone's like, when you want to watch something, I was like, yeah, let's watch my favorite show, movies. And so I'm always trying to get my wife, Katie, to watch something with me. And we figured out that one thing that we both really like is Alfred Hitchcock thrillers. So we've burned through maybe 5 of them in the past year. And we're probably going to keep going. Honestly, most of that was just in the past couple months. And we're probably going to keep going. But we watched Rear Window, which I had never seen, Vertigo, which I had never seen, North by Northwest, which I had seen once, Psycho, which I had seen multiple times. We watched The Lady Vanishes. We watched Rebecca, and that might be it. We watched one other one. What's that? The pirate one that he did, Jamaica Inn, because that's also based off of a book by whatever the name of the writer is who also wrote Rebecca. But anyway, so now I've seen something like 7 Hitchcocks. And I know Nate's a big fan of Hitchcock too. So, Nate, what percentage of Hitchcock's filmography have you seen?
Oh, that's a good question. He has a ton of movies that he made.
Yeah.
I think the total number is 50 plus.
It's like, yeah, exactly. Well, he started in the silent era, didn't he?
Right. And went through the 70s.
I know. He probably has like a great movie in like 6 different decades. It's like a Steven Spielberg type thing, you know?
No doubt. And I was going to ask, I think you mentioned you were rewatching Rear Window at some point. So have you seen it multiple times now?
Yes. So I watched it 3 months ago, and then I actually watched it twice this week to prep for the pod. So I'm up to 3 viewings at this point.
Okay.
this was my second time watching Rear Window. I actually, maybe surprisingly, have not watched very much Hitchcock, at least of his films. I've seen a fair bit of his anthology show that he had called Alfred Hitchcock Presents, or variously the Alfred Hitchcock Hour. I've seen a lot of that. Of the features, I've seen Psycho many times. North by Northwest, I've seen. That's about it. The next one I want to check off is Vertigo. Oh, actually, one that I watched recently that I thought was really good was Rope. The one where the illusion is that it's all a single shot.
I haven't seen Rope.
Also got Jimmy Stewart.
Well, a lot of his movies have Jimmy Stewart in them. I mean, Rear Window and Vertigo both star Jimmy Stewart as the sort of neurotic, inside-out version of the classic Jimmy Stewart image from, like, It's a Wonderful Life, where he's just oh, shucks, Zuzu pedals, like everyman American. Here he's kind of got, like, this sexual neurosis going on in both this and Vertigo. Rope, any others?
I think is it The Man Who Knew Too Much? I believe. I think it's 4. So I think it's those 3 The Man Who Knew Too Much. Yeah.
And there's at least one movie that he made twice. He made, I think, once early and then once later in his career. I could be wrong. Is it Man Who Knew Too Much? I'm going to look this up now.
It might be.
Let's see. Hitchcock made same movie twice.
Is it The Lady Vanishes and then the other time it was called something different? Like, what was the 39 Steps? Was that the same thing as The Lady Vanishes?
I'm not sure, but the thing that I was thinking of was The Man Who Knew Too Much. So he made it in 1956, but then he also made it in 1934. But apparently he altered the plot and the script between the 2 times that he made it. Who else did that? Oh, 10 Commandments, right?
Yeah, Cecil B. DeMille.
Yeah. And then I think Ozu, the Japanese director, did it at least once. It's like Floating Weeds and then The Story of Floating Weeds or something like that.
Not to be confused with Support Your Local Sheriff and Support Your Local Gunfighter, where the same team made the same movie 2 years apart for some reason.
Right, have pretty much the same plot, yeah. It's like you'd think it'd be a sequel, but it basically is the same story over again. But I guess a lot of sequels are basically the same story over again, you know? We're kind of losing track of what we were talking about here, which is Rear Window and Alfred Hitchcock. So I feel like sometimes these genre directors, they kind of go up and down in critical esteem over time. And I feel like Hitchcock right now often gets mentioned among like the best directors. Like people are high on Hitchcock in film discourse right now. And that would include me. I'm high on Hitchcock right now. Nate, would you say he ranks up there with your favorite directors?
Oh, no question. And yeah, I think you're right. I think among people who are, serious enough film people to even know Hitchcock movies, he kind of seems to have a 100% approval rating.
Right.
I don't know of any, serious film critic or person who's like, nah, Hitchcock doesn't do anything for me. I don't like any of it.
I'm out on Hitchcock. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm out on Hitchcock. And, maybe like you said, maybe that's because he made so many, like there's bound to be at least 1 or 2 you'll like.
That's an interesting thing too, is you'll find really divisive opinions about what's his best and like what are his top 3 or whatever, which how many directors are there where you could ask like 10 different people who are the top 3 movies and you would get like across those 10 answers, you would get like 18 different films, like there's not to make Steven Spielberg maybe, like who else is up there where you'd get that many different answers by asking people what are their favorites.
I think his top 5 or 10 movies can stand up with pretty much anyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If you want to go, if you want to just put together a roster of, say someone's 10 best movies, his will be hard to beat.
That's an interesting way to think about a director. Is like take different numbers. Okay, like 1, 3, 10, and like who, if you took just their best X, where would they place? And like that's kind of the benefit of someone who's prolific, is like you can stretch that out a little bit. Like Woody Allen is another example where like you take Woody Allen's 10 best movies and because he made like 55 movies, I think he has another one in the works. I never know. At this point, he's both very old and it's harder for him to find money and cast because of all of the bad press, but like
there was a long stretch where he made one literally every single year.
It was insane. And some years he made 2. We talked a little bit about that when we talked about September, which was the first Woody Allen we talked about on the pod. But I kind of like it when directors make a lot of movies. I feel like, I don't know, there's just something to be said for like putting something out there, and even if it's a little different, even if it's a little weird, even if it's a little uneven, there's another thing for fans of the director to go out and discover, you know? I don't know.
Sure. And if someone has 10 great movies, I don't care if they made bad ones also. Like, it doesn't make me think any less of those movies.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah.
All that said, I've also seen some like Hitchcock revisionism in recent years. Specifically, people like to point out that I guess he was mean to his actresses. Really put them through the ringer.
He's a director.
Yeah.
They all are.
Yeah, that's something you hear too. And like, I mean, yeah, so like any director from the pre-19X, like what, 1990s, I don't know, you're going to find problematic stuff in either their personal lives or their films from a modern political lens, or often cases both. Like even Kubrick was very demanding on his actors, and people kind of dispute, was he actually abusive or was he just kind of grumpy, etc. Hitchcock, you get a little bit of that too. He also has some idiosyncratic views on gender. I think that come out in many of his films. He also, there's a thing, the Hitchcock, I've heard it termed different things, but it's not uncommon for villains or henchmen villains in his movies to be coded as gay in some way. Not always, though. I think, isn't it Strangers? No, wait. Is it Strangers on a Train where the two leads are coded as gay? I don't know. There's one where they are, but that's another thing.
Yeah, they're not. I mean, you could read it that way in that one.
Oh, Rope is another one, right?
Rope was very gay. It was based on the real life case of Leopold and Loeb, which was, yeah, they were pretty much gay. So
one nickname I've heard for Hitchcock, and I might not be getting this exactly right, but it's something like the king of suspense or the master of suspense. So that's the big thing, is suspense. So he makes almost exclusively what we would call genre films, which is that they're not just dramas, but they have some element of crime to them, mystery. He never really did, to my knowledge, anything that's like sci-fi, or the closest he came to horror, to my knowledge, is Psycho. Then again, he has 50-something films, so I don't know what it is in all of his movies. But to my knowledge, he's mostly known as like a thriller guy and a mystery guy. Would that, and Spy is another thing. Espionage is in a lot of his. Would that kind of match up with your reading, Nate?
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I've heard people say that he basically worked in that same genre his whole career, and I think that's largely true, but also his movies still feel unlike anything else in a lot of ways. Like Vertigo feels like nothing else.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that it would be reductive to say that he only makes thrillers, and because that makes it sound like they're all the same. But each one it's very, very much its own unique beast with kind of its own flavor, its own mission statement. It's particularly later in his career with like his Imperial era, where like every single film he came out with was like either a masterpiece or like a divisive gem that some people thought was a masterpiece, some people don't like, you know? So like there was something like 8 films in a row that would qualify for, and all of them are like very distinct. I haven't seen every single one, but by reputation at least, you know?
His movies are also often very funny in a way that I don't think, he gets credit for, or that you might suspect based on, it's a suspense thriller, they're not these humorless, just dark spy plots.
No, he does have a good sense of humor. And in addition to that, a lot of his films are structured around a romance, some couple coming together or some couple rekindling their love and deciding to unite. So it's like some of them play it more as drama, like Vertigo. I wouldn't really call a romantic comedy at all, but North by Northwest is like very much a romantic comedy. And I think you could say Rear Window is structured a lot like a romantic comedy too. And it's kind of funny, and they have like banter. It feels sort of like a rom-com in addition to all the other things that it is. But we can kind of tease that out, because I think with many of Hitchcock's movies, you can come back to them and see them slightly differently, and maybe in a different genre, maybe with a different thematic focus, different part of the mystery kind of standing out to you. That's been my experience rewatching Hitchcock. I will say I haven't found a Hitchcock movie that I've liked a lot less seeing it a second time. Like, I tend to think his movies rewatch well. Like there's like layers to unravel there, basically.
Oh, in my experience, I love them all the more I watch them. In fact, a lot of them I didn't particularly like the first time I watched them.
Interesting, yeah.
And some of that might have been I was young and stupid, and just kind of didn't get it. But a lot of my favorites of his, I saw him once, 5, 10 years ago. I was like, yeah, okay. And then the more I watched him, I was like, no, this is actually incredible.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's keep that in mind. I want to talk through some of the things that I was trying to make sense of that kind of bothered me the first time through on Rear Window. So I think I'm ready to dive in. What I'd like to do is once we kind of get through it all, and maybe after we rate or maybe before we rate, I don't know, we can say, like, particularly Nate, you and I both have watched several Hitchcocks. Brian, it sounds like you haven't watched as many as we have, but like, I want to hear what, like, if you have a top 3 or a top 4 or something like that, maybe we could talk about that at the end here. But are we ready to dive into Rear Window? So Rear Window opens with this really cool credits sequence. So we're kind of inside this building. It's an apartment. We'll learn it's Jeff's apartment. And he's got, I think it's his apartment. And we see this, these window shades going up one at a time. And it's like a very aesthetic thing. And one thing I've come to appreciate about Alfred Hitchcock is his credit sequences are almost always bangers. Like, if Brian, we've talked about doing a top 5 at some point, like top 5 credit sequences. I would be forcing myself to limit myself on Hitchcocks if we did that. Like, I would probably, if I forced myself to just one Hitchcock, I would be leaving some out of my actual top 5, But like, for example, Psycho, it has like the letters kind of appear and they kind of like jagify, like in this sort of interesting way.
Yeah, several come from graphic designer Saul Bass.
Who? Saul Bass?
Yeah. I think it's Saul Bass.
I'd believe that, yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, did the Psycho credits and I think several of the others. Yeah, Saul Bass, American graphic designer, Oscar-winning filmmaker, best known for his design of motion picture title sequences.
Oh, wow, that's cool. That would be a cool career. You're like the credit sequence guy. I like, so North by Northwest has kind of this uneven grid that like gradually transformed into like a building. I think it's like a skyscraper. That one's pretty cool. And Vertigo, I mean, the score in Vertigo is just so good, but like you have the accompaniment of the score with like this zoom in on a woman's face and then kind of these psychedelic colors. That's another great one. So, but yeah, Rear Window. So we get this credit sequence and then it opens with a peek through a rear window of this apartment into a courtyard. So it's this courtyard kind of between these different apartment complexes. And we're here on a very hot day. So everybody has their windows open. And so we peer out, we see the courtyard, but more importantly, we see into all these windows and we see these different lives that are kind of going on in each of these different windows that we're peering into. So we kind of have running parallel to the quote unquote main story, I guess, like, let's say the story of the main character and his kind of what's going on with him to all these other stories sort of happening in micro. And it's very interesting when they sometimes get intertwined, etc.
And I just want to say how much I admire the production design of this movie, because the whole conceit structurally and thematically is that it's a big dollhouse. I mentioned when we talked about Little Shop of Horrors that was kind of like a Broadway set writ large, that it was clear that the whole neighborhood was kind of artificial, but that meant the filmmakers could control every aspect of it, of the space, like to the point of controlling the sun in the sky. And this is that idea times 10. Like the sky, the few times that you see the sky in this courtyard, you can tell it's like an enormous scrim. Like this whole outside is kind of inside. But it allows for these viewpoints where you've got this deep focus, like through sometimes multiple layers of windows, looking in at these scenes that you can watch unfold, and just knowing that it was all orchestrated.
I think, like, the sort of most common line that you'll hear about, like, what is quote unquote Rear Window about is it's about being a voyeur, voyeurism, peering out into other people's lives, and the sort of thrill and messiness of that, the darkness, but also curiosity of that, and how kind of interrogating, like, is that unethical? Is that dangerous? Is that appropriate, inappropriate? And I think the consensus would probably say that it's like condemning it, but I really think it's a little more nuanced than that. And I don't even know if that's necessarily the main theme of Rear Window. So I think we can maybe tease through that a little bit. And also, like, another thing that you'll kind of hear, if that's 1A, 1B is it's about movies and, like, linking movies with being a voyeur, with peering into other people's lives uninvited and making judgments of them and making inferences about their lives. I mean, that's basically what the act of watching a movie and watching a TV show is. So, again, I think those are the things you'll hear cited as the most common themes. And I do think there is something to those. In particular, watching through this movie the second time, I got it a little bit the first time through, but I really got it the second time through, is I think Hitchcock is using this movie a little bit as like a dark mirror into his craft and his own psychological impulses that make him want to make movies and make him curious about the stories that he makes. And I think that's kind of compelling, and there's a lot of things that kind of feed into that. Again, I don't think it's the only thing to take away from this. And one thing that you said in an email to me fairly recently, Nate, that I really liked was that, and I'd kind of like to hear you expand on this, is you believe that movies should be entertainment with art conveyed with the entertainment. I don't remember exactly what your wording is, but rather than art for the sake of art not being entertaining. So, like, for you, a movie has to be entertaining for its ideas to be interesting. Am I getting that sort of right?
Yeah. I want the art to be layered under the entertainment and not the other way around. And I think a lot of bad movies fail that test. And I think Hitchcock, who I think, as far as I know, when he was making films at the time, was viewed as sort of just a popcorn filmmaker. He was making genre movies. He was making entertainment first and foremost. And his esteem has risen over the years as people realize there might be a little more depth in those movies than people thought at the time. But he wanted to get you into the theater and entertain you at first, which I think is the correct mindset. Yeah, Dan, you mentioned how it's often viewed as being similar to watching movies itself. And you can see that easily because the opening of those shades at the beginning of the movie in the credit sequence resembles the curtains going up and the show's about to begin.
I like that. That's a great observation. Yeah. And I think another aspect of it, which will be toyed with later in the film, is that the lens through which we're seeing those things are very flat because we're looking into a window, and they're kind of contained worlds that we are just peeping into, but are not, like, brought into the space where the main character, whose perspective through which we see the film, not into his space at all, So our protagonist is Jimmy Stewart. The character's name is L.B. Jeffries. I think he mostly goes by Jeff. That's at least what his romantic partner, who we'll get to in a second, calls him. And he is a wheelchair-bound photographer. That's kind of the first thing we learn about him. He has undergone a serious leg injury, like a very badly broken leg. He's got, like, this enormous, thick plaster cast around his leg. So he kind of has to always hold it out fully extended, very rigid.
It's even, like, partly up around his waist.
Yeah, so it's like really not just inhibiting him, but, like, kind of overtaking his body and preventing him from really moving very much. Yeah, so I found it really interesting the kind of economy with which ideas about Jeff are introduced in these opening sequences. But I would say, like, as we get started, what are some important things, some important characteristics of Jeff?
Well, you sort of learn that he's traveled all over to take his pictures, and he's sort of, I mean, the way he talks about his job with Grace Kelly, which we'll get to, he makes it sound like his job is the most dangerous, death-defying job out there. He sounds like he's going to war. The way he describes, like, sometimes, like, you're not sure where your food's coming from. You're sleeping outside. Like, you're traveling all over to take these pictures. So the idea is that he really hates being confined like this because that's not his life.
Right. He's like a photojournalist. So you see on the walls photos that he's taken, all his camera equipment on the shelves. He works for a magazine, like probably Life magazine or whatever was big in 1954, and he gets sent all around. And yes, the way that he talks is that maybe sometimes he covers conflict, but always it's like extreme environments.
And I think that kind of ties to the idea of a lot of the other ideas, but it particularly builds this, I don't know if irony is the right word, but this desire within Jeff, because his whole life is like going out and finding these dangerous stories filled with spectacle and intrigue. And what is he doing? He's sitting there looking out his window at people just living their lives, people walking their dogs and falling in love and doing their jobs and cleaning the house and things like that. So I think it's very interesting. And yeah, just kind of emphasizing that, like, not only is he a photographer, so like his life is viewing things and capturing them and framing it into a visual narrative, but that it always has to be the scariest, most exciting thing that he captures. That's what sells the photographs, So we learn that he's about a week away from getting his cast off. So he's been there for like 6 weeks or something. And so he's going just stir crazy. Like he can't wait to get moving. And like all of his nervous energies are kind of focused on like looking on what's going on in these different apartments. And so what I wanted to talk about, what are some of the households that he peers into? One of the first ones we see is this beautiful blonde dancer, frequently in a state of undress. This is kind of like what you would traditionally think of as a peeping Tom, like a horny dude looking in on a beautiful lady, Some of them get nicknames. I can't remember if she gets a nickname.
She's Miss Torso, right?
That's right, Miss Torso, yeah. And then another one is this woman on a lower level who seems to be very unlucky in love, goes on bad dates. She's Miss Lonely Hearts. There's another one that's kind of a newlywed married couple. Another one that I really like is the songwriter. I'm kind of like imagining it in my head because we kind of see it almost as like a flat tableau. So like the songwriter is kind of in the upper right. The Miss Lonely Hearts is kind of lower center left. It's centered around this courtyard, So another one I really like is this songwriter. So like he's kind of in the upper right of the tableau. And one reason I like this, there's a couple reasons I like it. So first of all, he's a piano player. That's how he writes his songs. So unless I'm mistaken, I don't think this movie has any score other than diegetic noises. And so this guy is kind of providing the musical score because he's always writing stuff on his piano. So we're hearing the music and it's kind of providing the film a score, which is a clever touch. And I also even think this story kind of is Hitchcock looking inward in micro here because it's like the songwriter we see has demons of his own. He's it seems like he struggles with alcohol and finding love and throwing parties, but like trying to turn all of this chaos around him into beautiful art, which we do here and which we do appreciate. So I like that one.
And the Hitchcock appearance is in the songwriter's apartment.
Oh, is it? Is it during the party?
No, it's early. It's one of the first times we see the songwriter's apartment. He's just like over there as a visitor of him.
Yeah, he was like adjusting a portrait on the wall or something. He was like in the corner of the room.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's funny. That's another thing. Hitchcock, does he appears in pretty much all of his movies in a little cameo, right?
Yeah.
Are there any other? Well, we'll talk about the main one here, I guess. So the one that will ultimately be of interest is another household where there's this couple. This one's kind of like front and center. It's like the one right across from Jeff's apartment, and it's this couple that they're probably, I don't know, in their 50s or so. So they're a little bit older than I think we're supposed to believe that Jeff is. Although Jimmy Stewart, I can never tell how old he actually is, you know. And they're kind of in what appears to be an unhappy marriage, and that we'll eventually learn that this character's name is Thorwald. So those are kind of the main ones. Are there any other apartments or stories that you guys recall that left an impression on you?
Well, one family is up at the very, very top, and they do this thing where they have a little, like, Yorkshire Terrier dog, and the way that they let it go out on a walk is they put it in a little picnic basket like Toto and lower it down on a pulley system from, like, the 4th floor down to the bottom of the courtyard, and it'll hop out of the basket, do its business, and then hop back in the basket. And every time I saw this, I was like, this looks so dangerous. This is not a reliable, like, OSHA would not approve.
Curious. Are they the same ones who sleep out on the balcony too?
I think that's right.
Yeah, apparently it's too much trouble for them to actually take their dog downstairs and outside.
You gotta drop this like convoluted pulley system with no guardrails. Yeah.
Also, this setup, this way that the courtyard is viewed, and we've got Jeff as our protagonist, it kind of does two things. Like, a big theme is that our interactions with our neighbors are limited, that we are kind of all living our own lives, and we don't, at this modern day and age of the 1950s, don't care about each other anymore. And so that the only person who would notice others is like a creep, a voyeur. It's unnatural even to be taking this interest in others. That's how it's framed at the start. But it had me thinking, I read something not too long ago. I don't remember if it was Reddit or where I saw this, but it was like, think about, have you ever seen your neighbors carry in their groceries? Or is that something that only you do as the protagonist? Like, are they just NPCs in the simulation? Or do you see your neighbors carrying in their groceries and living real, full 3D lives?
It's pretty funny. So I don't know if I've mentioned this on pod. I bring it up on my work phone calls all the time, but the way that I have my office positioned is like my desk is right opposite a big window that I always have the curtain up or the blinds up. And so I kind of am doing what Jeff is doing like all the time, except I can't really see into other people's houses. So most of the time there's nothing going on. It's just I'm looking out at a cul-de-sac. But so I have seen my neighbors pull in with their groceries, and I live next to a path, so who's always walking by and stuff. And I always wonder if they like look up and see me the same way that I look out and see them. Because it kind of makes you wonder, is anybody peering in on Jeff the way that he's peering out on everyone else? But the answer is not really, in general. That we see, at least, but who knows, you know? And then we meet the other characters who are going to interact with Jeff throughout this film. Because remember, we're going to stay in his perspective. We're going to stay in his apartment for this whole film. So one is his nurse named Stella, and she's played by Thelma Ritter. So do we know Thelma Ritter from any other stuff?
I do. She's in Miracle on 34th Street, which... Have you seen that, Dan?
I still haven't. I might have seen it like once when I was a kid or something, but I haven't seen it recently.
Okay, you got to watch Miracle on 34th Street. Now that you've finally checked off Dr. Strangelove, that's the next one. It's seasonal. But this actress plays a fairly small role in that movie, but she's a mom who brings her kid to visit Santa, and she's like, don't tell him that he's going to get a fire truck for Christmas because I've been to all the stores and they don't have this fire truck that he wants. And the Santa is like, oh no, I know that they have it across the street at Gimbel's. And the Santa works at Macy's, and so everybody is like scandalized. Why is he advertising the other department store? So it's like an important plot beat, even though she's not in the movie for very long. But then she's like really won over by the magic of Santa because he crosses the interdepartmental picket lines.
I really like her performance in this. I think she's funny, but like she has kind of a lot to do for what is ostensibly a character that we don't get too much depth on. But like, I don't know, she kind of brings a lot of depth, and we end up learning kind of a little bit more about her personality. And she kind of provides sort of like, to me, she's like kind of the true crime enthusiast of this. Like she's just kind of vicariously enjoying the curiosity that Jeff has about what's going on. And then we also meet Lisa Fremont. So I like the way that we meet her. The nurse says, "What kind of trouble?" Asking, because he's saying there's trouble outside, and he says, "Lisa Fremont." And then she appears a scene later, and the way that she appears, she kind of like casts this shadow over him. It's like a really cool character introduction, because we see him, he's kind of dozing off, and then this shadow kind of looms over him, and it's like threatening. And then we look up, and it's like the most beautiful movie star that there's ever been. It's like Grace Kelly made up perfectly, and that's who his girlfriend is, this like source of turmoil within him, which is kind of this funny. I didn't notice it the first time through, but the way that she's kind of framed in this imposing manner as a character introduction, I think is a clever touch by Hitchcock to kind of show that, at least in my eyes, tying together what Jeff is going through in his relationship to kind of what he's seeing out there. And it's also done even just by the dialogue I mentioned, because Stella's asking about what is there going on in this world as he's looking out there. What's the trouble? And he answers, it's Lisa Fremont. So it's kind of like tying those things together, which I think is pretty clever.
So the way that she's introduced before we even see her as, yeah, you said, a threat, and kind of the whole crux of the movie is that he fears, I guess, losing freedom, losing the ability to light out to the territories. He wants to have this adventurous life and not be rooted in one place. And that's all a metaphor for being in the committed marriage relationship. But, you know, he's basically telling the boomer jokes of, "Oh, take my wife, please." But then you see her, and she's the most beautiful person in the world. And it's like, this is kind of silly. I don't relate to you, Jeff.
You wouldn't be feeling that way about Grace Kelly, you don't think, Brian?
I don't think so.
If she was like, not just your girlfriend, but like throwing herself at you. Because the meme that you sometimes see about this is like, Grace Kelly, : "Please come have sex with me." Jimmy Stewart: "No, I got to look out at the other people's windows," or something like that.
"Al, let's have sex." No, Peg.
That's the Simpsons doing Married with Children, is that right? Yeah.
That's right.
But yeah, so he's already in this relationship with her, and she is not just beautiful, but she's rich. She's like this socialite in these social circles. She's like bringing him fancy restaurant food, even though he can't go out. She's kind of perfect in many ways. Like, I think that's interesting about her is she's not really presented as having any major downsides as a girlfriend. You know, she's like trying to get him a job as like a well-paid portrait photographer. What are you thinking at this point, Nate?
Well, first of all, I want to say I think that introduction, like the physical introduction of her in this, might be my favorite character introduction in any movie that I've ever seen. And some of this, I mean, we might touch on more on later. I think her perfection is the point. And I think the conflict between that and how Jeff feels about her is largely the point. But that, you know, I might save that for later. So
yeah, I think Jeff even says that. He's like, the problem is she's perfect.
And so I can't remember exactly when we have these conversations, but we kind of gather from the first few conversations that he has with her that basically, yeah, the dynamic is she wants him to settle down, stay local, have kind of this ritzy, comfortable lifestyle with her. And he wants to go out and do rugged things. And she's like, well, maybe I could come with you. And he's like, you couldn't make it out there. You kidding me? You rich girl. Are they in New York? Is that right? I'm trying to remember. Yeah. You rich New York girl. No way you could make it out there. And so, yeah, it's like, well, as with pretty much any romantic comedy, they're going to have to find some way to meet in the middle, or romantic drama, or whatever the case may be. Yeah, so that's kind of like the baseline of the character dynamics. But then where this movie kind of turns, we hit the inciting incident is one rainy night. And I like that it's the only rainy day that we see. It's the only day where there's any weather other than like clear blue skies. Jeff is looking out his window, looking into Thorwald right across from him, their apartment. And he sees what appears to be a big fight between them. And then he kind of dozes off. And when he wakes up, he sees Thorwald, the man, the husband, who is played by Raymond Burr. And Raymond Burr very mysteriously, this Thorwald character, takes 3 trips out of his apartment carrying a suitcase, or it's a briefcase or something, like some carrying case with him, out and then back in, out and then back in. And it's kind of an interesting and ambiguous framing because we don't know what's going on. We can't see what's going on. And it's on the line of like something that someone would do that's actually suspicious, as opposed to somebody just doing whatever it is they do with their life. Like, I don't know what you're doing with your time. You just, okay, you had to go run an errand and you came back. I don't know, like, what's going on? But Jeff develops this theory that what had happened is that Thorwald murdered his wife, chopped her to bits, and carried her out of the apartment. And that's why he was taking those trips out. He was dumping the parts of her in different places. And so that's kind of the thrust, is he convinces himself that there's this crime. Now, by the way, we don't see the crime, or this even hypothetical crime, let's say, because that's kind of a major thrust, is like, was there even a crime? And one thing that struck me watching through the second time is it's very interesting how we're like physically limited looking into the spaces through the windows. So like the walls and the barriers of the window are like the edge of the frame. And like all of the quote unquote good stuff happens just off frame. You know, Torso Lady, or whatever her name is, gets undressed just out of sight of the window. The potential murder happens in a spot that we can't see. Like, so it's like kind of cutting us off from that, but also like sort of serving the role of like the movie censor, or like the MPAA. I don't think it existed then yet, but yeah. So I thought that was really interesting. Now there is one thing, and it's to my knowledge only one thing that we see throughout the film, not from his perspective. And that's when he's asleep, we see him asleep, and the camera kind of peeks up at the Thorwalds, and we see a somewhat obfuscated woman leaving the apartment shortly after he's done those other trips. But he doesn't see that. He's asleep. He's not seeing that. This really threw me off the first time I saw the movie. I was like, well, now I'm thinking that this is Thorwald's wife. I'm thinking we, the audience, saw her leaving. So I don't know. I'm still not sure exactly why Hitchcock included us seeing a woman leaving. And once I kind of got through like actually knowing where this was headed, it didn't really bother me. And in fact, it provides like kind of some interesting like thoughts on the perspective of the film and like what we should be thinking. But what were you thinking during this, Brian?
So at this point, I want to say I knew about this movie before I ever watched it for the first time. It's one of Hitchcock's greats. So it's when you become a cinephile, it's on the list early of people telling you, oh, you got to watch Rear Window, you got to watch Vertigo, etc. And it's also kind of seeped into broader pop culture. So I had seen references to this premise, parodies of this premise. There's a Simpsons episode that does Rear Window. And in that, Bart breaks his leg and is watching out the window, and he sees what he thinks is Flanders committing a murder next door. Ultimately, the way that episode turns out is it was all a misunderstanding. And part of that as I think we talked about in one of our recent discussions, when it is a TV episode, you can't really change the status quo too much. To have Flanders turn out to be a murderer would change things. It would go beyond the pale. Things wouldn't be the same in the next episode, and you can't have that in a sitcom. But it planted that seed in my mind of, is Jeff right when he immediately latches on to the suspicion, oh, a murder happened. Oh, a murder happened. He's a murderer.
A guy left his house, so it must have been a murder. Yeah.
It's like, where are things going to go? Because also, we saw so much, or I guess we didn't see too much that was explicit, but we saw the pieces of suitcase goes out, linger on the hacksaw. And it's like everything is just so that it's like told to us, oh, he killed her, he chopped her up, he took the pieces out. And so I was wondering, and I want to know where your heads were at the first time you watched this, of how are things going to turn out? Is Jeff going to be right or what?
Oh, I love the way it immediately makes you think there was a murder. Yeah, with very little hard evidence. You know, after that rainy night, Jeff wakes up, and then you see things like, oh, the bedroom of the Thorwalds is dark and closed off, but his wife was, you know, in bed all the time and needed care all the time. So why isn't he going in there? You know, and then you see him, yeah, he's wrapping up saws and knives in a suspicious looking way. And before you know it, you're totally swept up in this, just like Jeff is, and you're convinced there must have been a murder, even though, I mean, it's a preposterous leap. But you want to it's nice thing, you want to get swept up into it. Like, you want to believe there was a murder, just like Jeff, in a way, wants to believe.
It also had me thinking of, in the Harry Potter books, whenever something goes awry, Harry blames Malfoy. Oh, Malfoy's behind it all. He's the bad guy. He's plotting. He's the one who's doing things. And, like, by the 5th or 6th book, Harry gets called out on it. They're like, well, you can't just assume that it's always Malfoy, Harry. And then the end of the book rolls around, and yeah, it was Malfoy again. Harry was right.
Oh, yeah. That's the 6th book, and that's an absolutely genius, like, series-wide meta twist. Like, honestly, reading through that book, I was like, you gotta shut up about Snape and Malfoy. You always think it's Snape, you always think it's Malfoy. It's never Snape and Malfoy. They've literally always been the red herrings. Every single time, they're always the red herrings. They're not up to evil. And then wouldn't you know, this time, Malfoy lets in the bad guys. This time, Snape kills Dumbledore. And so I think it's ingenious, like, how J.K. Rowling kind of set us up to, like, basically be exactly where Ron and Hermione were like, yeah, no, it's obviously not them. It's never them. You need to chill out, dude. But yeah.
Well, and that's why, and I'm sure we'll get to this, but that's why I think the character of Jeff's detective friend is so important. You know, he brings in this detective friend of his to come and examine the situation. And, you know, and who he totally assumes is going to completely believe his theory and go arrest Thorwald.
Right. To get swept up in it in the same way. Yeah. So yeah, Jeff basically immediately decides this is what happened, this murder. And he tries to rope both Stella and Lisa into his theory. And at first they're resistant, but they gradually kind of buy into it. They gradually, like, they humor him. They appease him. They hear him out. They don't, like, completely shut him down because they know he's going kind of stir crazy, you know? But then it kind of gradually morphs into, like, okay, wait, hold on. I'm kind of feeling what you're putting down here. I'm kind of with you on this. Tell me a little bit more about your theory.
It's like they all get hooked on watching the show. It's like, oh, catch me up. What happened last episode?
Exactly, yeah. And so I thought this was funny. One interesting thing, so Nate, I was trading emails with Nate about this, and you sort of gave me a summarized version of your theory, which we can maybe expand upon a little bit. But one bit here that I think I liked is that, and I was looking for it through when I watched it again, and I found a lot of evidence to kind of support this reading, is that, like, Jeff is not only struggling with, like, I want to go out and be a wild man, but that's, like, kind of intimately connected with his own sense of inadequacy, his own sense of impotence even, because it's like he needs to do that to be the tough guy. You know, it's like he can't be a complete and satisfactory romantic partner in numerous senses to Grace Kelly, because like it seems like multiple times this is where I think the meme that I was about this movie comes from, is like multiple times she's like initiating romance with him, and he's like, okay, but look, you got to go see what Thorwald's doing now, like breaks it off and like brings in the theory, the talking about the murder. And to me that like highlights this idea that he fears he can't satisfy her. He feels he's becoming impotent, and in some ways already has, because he's so locked into this apartment. And yeah, I don't know. What are you thinking about this here, Nate?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of that in this movie. I think that's the main reason why he's so wary of really committing to Lisa. I think it's less about, oh, I want to travel around the world and take my pictures, and more about feeling like he's insecure about whether he can satisfy her in all sorts of ways. I think there's a reason he's so uncomfortable by that married couple he sees in his courtyard, who are like all over each other and super happy, and like, and you know, in their bedrooms the entire time. He's watching them curiously, but also looks very uncomfortable with it. And yeah, the cast is such a huge symbol of impotence, the way I read it. And even just the way he talks to her. I mean, there's a moment in the movie when she's, essentially all over him, and he says something like, "Aren't you tired?" Which, that's the cliche of like, we can't have sex tonight because I'm tired. He's almost like wishing that she was tired. And she's like, "No, I'm good." He's like, "Oh, why aren't you tired?" You know? And I think just in general, I think he knows that she's so perfect and would demand so, or in theory, would demand so much of a partner. And he doesn't think he can provide that to her. And I think a lot of what he sees across the way in Thorwald's apartment is a manifestation of his fears of marriage, and what's the worst way that this could go.
Right. He's seeing like a dark vision of love. Like love ends in calamity. Commitment ends in such resentment that it can only explode out in the worst possible way. Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's almost like he wills the whole thing to happen.
Right. Well, I mean, in some senses, that kind of feels like what it is. Like we saw things that, again, you could view in a different way, and it would be maybe not innocuous. It might be strange, but like it wouldn't say this is a murder. But like he basically took just a couple of like, data points and drew a whole graph of like, this is how the murder went down. Here's the different things, reasons why this is true, based off just little bits that he can kind of see just from peeking in the window,
Totally. And I think and maybe this is going down a different road, but I think he's also dealing with his fear deep down that what if he did something like that to Lisa one day? Is that a part of him? Is that ever something that he would ever do as the ultimate way of getting rid of her?
Interesting. So like he's kind of got this own violent impulse in him that's maybe tied to like the way that he in his life has gone out and chased this adventure. And he's even just being at home for like a few weeks is totally kind of losing it a little bit in this hot weather. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, each tableau, each thing that's going on in the different apartments we keep checking in on is like a different paradigm for how you could interact with people.
Mm-hmm.
For sure.
Like socially, romantically, just where are you at in your life, and what does success look like?
Yeah, and at the very beginning of the movie, there's a moment where he's talking on the phone with his boss, about, I'm still in the cast for another week, blah, blah, blah. And he's looking over at Thorwald. The boss is encouraging Jeff to settle down and get married. And Jeff is almost expressing solidarity with Thorwald. He's seeing him be, nagged. But that's why, to me, it's all just, essentially, I'm not saying it's all literally in his head, but just a manifestation of his fears of marriage and commitment.
I was thinking of 727, as I often do, the Garfield YouTube essay, but where he says impotent. He was impotent. He had a metaphorical pipe that did not work.
The metaphorical pipe is his bound up leg.
Or his telescopic camera lens.
That's right. Well, I wanted to talk about that because that's interesting to me, and this kind of brings it back to really tying it directly with the experience of watching movies or even making movies. Like Hitchcock kind of reckoning with, I make movies because I also struggle with all of these complex thoughts about love and danger and life, and like, but ultimately I'm just making this thing that you just kind of see, you know? And because the way that he zooms in on the world is he literally takes a big camera lens and like looks through it as if it's a telescope. I like that image of him looking through a camera, and it's like this very striking telescopic lens. You're right, Brian. It's pretty cool. So this is kind of where the character that Nate mentioned comes in. So he's a buddy of Jeff's. He's Lieutenant Doyle, played by an actor named Wendell Corey. And Jeff kind of calls him up like, oh, I got a juicy one for you here. There's a murder for you to come solve. And at first he's like, oh, wow, well, yeah, I'll go take a look at this. And it's almost like pathetically comic. Like, Jeff's like, no, there's a murder over there. And Doyle's like, well, the evidence actually says that there's not a murder over there. Like, okay, why do you think there's a murder? Well, he left with his wife's... He left and his wife's not there anymore. Okay, well, she got a train ticket. Well, the stuff... He took out stuff. Okay, well, they made a shipment to where she was supposed to be going. And, like, it's something like 3 or 4 times he calls up the detective. He's like, I got something new for you about this murder case I was telling you about. I will admit, though, I did find... not the character himself, but the interactions sort of baffling and almost frustrating the first time through. It's like, because I too wanted to be swept away. I wanted there to be a rich, juicy story, but like every time the detective appears, he pours cold water on that. He's like, meh, there's nothing for you to worry about. There's not a case here. We can't push this further because there's nothing to say that there actually was a murder based on what all the evidence that we can find. And there's kind of some interesting dynamics on what we were just saying about Lisa here, where she's kind of sort of rooting also for there to be something. She's invested in it, but it's almost like she sees that like this case has kind of drawn them together. It seems like they kind of start to feel a little more comfortable being together as Jeff is like in full on detective mode, digging into it.
It's almost like to be the cool girl. She's going to be into what he's into. And so it's like, oh, a murder across the way? Okay, sure. I'm team Killer Thorwald.
But I think that she's also sensing to some extent and reacting to that this is bringing life to him. Like he's invested in this, you know? I don't know.
Yeah, it's a well-known psychological theory that when people, like a couple, are exposed to or face any sort of, dangerous situation or adrenaline-filled situation, it brings them together. And I think this movie understands, like, having Grace Kelly come over to spend the night at your apartment to maybe investigate a murder sounds really fun. And they're really getting a thrill out of this in a way that you could argue is kind of gross and not morally pure at all. But I love the way this whole story of marital conflict gone wrong or relationship conflict gone wrong all over this courtyard is bringing Jeff and Lisa together in their own twisted way.
I completely agree. It's like their kink almost, It's like, oh, let's go peep on all the other dark stuff going out there, and like that like gets them going. It's kind of funny, which does make the detective character kind of interesting because over and over again he's like, no, you're wrong, there's nothing to it here, stop making me investigate this because there's no murder. And then finally, like after the 3rd or 4th time of this, he like the detective comes in and he just lays out boom 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 boom, this is exactly what happened and why there was no murder. The wife got on a train, she left. He's cleaning up their place. He's moving out too. Story closed. And it's like, I think they even lampshaded in the dialogue. It's like, well, they're kind of sad that there's no murder. They're disappointed. And I think it's interesting that, in particular, like that Hitchcock not only does this to Jeff, but he also does it to the audience. So I'm kind of wondering, why is Hitchcock working so hard to convince us that there's no crime going on? I really struggled with this. Like, I didn't necessarily think it was bad storytelling, but I too felt deflated. I was like, what? Why are we doing this? I also suspected that if this was the conclusion at the 2/3 mark, there was probably a little bit more to unravel, but I don't know. What do you think about this storytelling device here, Nate?
Well, I think it's making you as the viewer question yourself also in the same way that Jeff is. Like, oh, why am I rooting for this murder to have occurred exactly? And I think also, I think it's smart that both explanations have a lot of support behind them. Like Jeff and Lisa's theories, there's pretty good reasons. I mean, as the movie goes on, at first it's kind of thin, but as it goes on, they have pretty good reasons for thinking something went wrong over there. But also the detective's reasoning, he's got eyewitnesses that saw the wife and train tickets and everything. It's like that's equally strong, if not stronger. And I think that's just like how it needs to be in order to sustain some of the suspense. The movie builds so well and it never drags for being in one location, which is rare in movies. Mm-hmm. And I think that ambiguity of what actually happened across the way is a big reason for that.
Yeah, I think that's true. Although, again, the first time through, and I think this kind of goes back to what we were saying about how Hitchcock tends to replay very well, like tends to look a little bit better. Like once I kind of understood all of that, I liked this section a lot more. The first time through, again, it just felt like Hitchcock was going out of his way to make this case with the lieutenant character, to make this case seem like less of a case. Like, oh, we shouldn't be. I mean, and I think you're also right that like it's Hitchcock forcing us to question our own impulses too. You used the word psychological earlier, and I think that's a really important one. My understanding is Hitchcock was really almost obsessed with like psychology and the way that it drives us to do things, and really built that into a lot of his movies. I mean, he even like around this time, the 50s and 60s in particular, I mean, he even made a movie called Psycho that is about a psycho quote unquote head case, and I think it's interesting to kind of and a lot of his movies, I'm thinking of Vertigo and Psycho, have bits of like Freudian psychology in their screenplay too. Like characters kind of trying.
Vertigo is entirely about psychological torment. But honestly, I guess what I would say is I think those feelings you had the first time you saw it with those detective scenes, I know they were a little frustrating for you, but I think that was kind of the goal.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting way to do it. And I feel like in general with Hitchcock, his movies are mysteries, but they don't seem structured the typical way that you think of a mystery being structured, where the quote unquote killer is revealed at the very end, the same time to the audience as it is to the protagonist. And so sometimes I'm kind of baffled in his movies, like when they reveal stuff. So like in Vertigo, I don't want to spoil Vertigo, but like we learn a secret about a character in Vertigo before the protagonist, Jimmy Stewart, learns the thing about a character. And that case, I actually think that works very, very well. But sometimes, like The Lady Vanishes, for example, we kind of learn what happened, not at the very end of the movie, but like around the 2/3 mark. And in that case, I felt like it kind of deflated the final third a little bit because there was a little bit less intrigue. Sometimes I think he errs too much on the side of suspense and less on like traditional mystery intrigue, although I think he still has tons of that in all of his movies. But I don't know, do you ever feel like that Hitchcock has a weird like pacing for when he reveals information to the viewer, Nate?
Yes, although can I go back real quick? I want to say kind of one last point about kind of what you were saying about the detective and
sure, yeah,
being frustrated with being kind of led to believe there's no case here. I think the other reason why that works for me is that it ultimately, I'm not going to say it doesn't matter, but it kind of doesn't matter whether or not Thorwald killed his wife. That's not really what the story's about. The story, I mean, at least for me, the story is about Jimmy Stewart coming to terms with these fears and, Jimmy Stewart's relationship with Grace Kelly. And so the fact that they're sort of almost willing this murder to have taken place, I mean, I think that's very interesting. But whether it actually did is secondary.
I think there's something to that. And in particular, I think if you even if you watch Thorwald very clearly, like throughout the end of the film, when he, as you said, basically becomes the villain, I think almost everything he does could be read ambiguously. Almost everything he says could be read ambiguously,
One thought about the pacing of Hitchcock movies that is almost kind of famous, that it's not what you would typically see, is in Psycho. Again, that's my touch point. That's the one I've seen so many times. Is famous because the ostensible protagonist dies, 20 minutes in. And then where do you go from there?
Psycho has 2 of like the 10 most famous plot twists in movie history. 2 of them in one movie. It's kind of crazy.
I think it's also part of why, like we said, his movies just feel so distinctive and so unlike everything else. Information is revealed at unexpected times. Certain things that you would think would only come at the very end, like what we learned in Vertigo, come long before the end. There's that scene in North by Northwest, 20 or 30 minutes in, where a lot of the mystery of George Kaplan is revealed by all those CIA guys, and it doesn't hurt us at all. But it just, you're always sort of on your toes.
Right. You're kind of thrown for a loop a little bit. Yeah. It's like he surprises you for sure.
Because like we said, because it's the psychology of the characters that ultimately matters the most.
He's definitely much more interested in us thinking about the character than thinking about the mystery itself in most cases.
Definitely. Which is why they rewatch so well. And movies that are only about the mystery don't rewatch well.
Yeah, I completely agree. There have been a bunch of movies where I've had that problem, where I loved it the first time through. And then I watched it again. I was like, after I knew what happened, I was like, meh. It's like, it's interesting, but it's not like it's gripping, where that has not been true for me with Hitchcock. So I like when they kind of accept basically the lieutenant's theory. They lower the shades, they lower the window, the curtains.
Time for intermission.
It's like, yeah, intermission. I like that. I didn't even think of that. Yeah. It's basically like putting a stop to their exploration. They're looking out in this quote unquote movie screen, but it's only for a moment because they hear a scream. It's like, oh, movie's back on. Raise the windows again. Let's look back out. And the scream is because that little Toto dog has died.
Okay, what did you think happened? Because I immediately assumed it fell out of that stupid basket. Like they were lowering it down from the 4th floor, it fell out of the basket and it died, because that is a preposterous setup.
That's kind of, I didn't think about that, but you're kind of right. It does set us up to think that this dog is not in this, even like, is a risk to itself,
Well, but that's part of the ambiguity. You might get into this, but the assumption is that Thorwald killed the dog. He might not have.
Yeah, I could be wrong. Do we ever get confirmation that Thorwald killed the dog? I don't think we do, right?
It comes close if it doesn't say it outright, because what the dog has been doing is sniffing around the flower beds, and Thorwald notices it sniffing around the flower beds and is like antsy about that.
But we also saw him like doing gardening work out there, so he could just be annoyed that this dog is pissing on his flowers,
But the reason that this moment is really important to me, that the dog dies, is the lady screams, and up to this point in the movie, we've kind of been locked into Jeff's mindset, which is a little misanthropic. It's like the Chad Jeff versus the virgin everyone else. He's got this privileged position. He is the viewer, and this isolation almost gives him like an elevated status. Like he's the intelligent one. He's the one who works for the elite magazine, and everybody else is just there to be seen, to be observed, and they're like not full people. And he forms this thesis that in this day and age, in the modern period, we're disconnected. Like everybody is their own universe and nothing crosses the divide, and oh, how heartless people have become. But then when the dog dies, it's like instantly the whole community connects in a way that we haven't seen until now. It's like everybody in all the different rooms is talking to each other.
I think that's a great point. I completely agree. And the way that I was actually thinking about it a little bit differently, but I think you're right. It's not just that they're talking to each other, but the big thing is it's been viewing outward. It's been a passive consumption experience. By the way, I also point out this is the first, to my recollection, the first like explicitly dark or violent thing that has happened. Like we know that a dog died. The dog died. That's irrefutable. That's the first thing that is irrefutable, that is dark, that has happened in this film, I think, to this point. But what really struck me is we're going to see very quickly, it goes from being a passive, I'm just kind of watching, to that barrier is shattered. Soon things are going to be going back and forth between the apartment and the outer area. And you're absolutely right that it's like almost instantaneous now. It's like a switch was flipped. And I just think this is kind of ingenious that like we have this whole setup where everything is just him looking out, projecting his own ideas, no interaction between them except just to watch them. And now the fourth wall is like very literally broken. Maybe not very literally, because there's not really a wall broken, but like the sense that he's in this enclosed space just looking out is shattered. I think this is awesome. This third act is my favorite part of the movie.
And I love how the dog, comes right after the detective has, thrown cold water over all of their dreams and made them actually start to reflect on, maybe there's nothing here, maybe we shouldn't be doing this. And then right away they're like, Thorwald didn't come to the window with everyone else, we're back in it. Immediately, because Thorwald didn't come to the window with to listen to this woman wailing about her dog. Like, oh, it must have been, he obviously killed the dog, and so therefore we're back in it.
I really noticed that the second time through. It's kind of funny, like they're on their flimsiest evidence yet, but they're still on their bullshit. They're like, we're in on it again.
Right. And you get swept up. Like, Brian, I think you're right. I think there is a line at the end that comes pretty close to admitting Thorwald did kill the dog. But in the moment, like, so he didn't come to the window. Maybe he just didn't care about the dog. Like,
maybe he was like taking a dump or something, like he's
right
cooking dinner.
But the first time you watch this, you're like, oh yeah, that does mean he killed the dog.
Well, it also had me thinking of, I watched that movie with Mark Wahlberg about the Boston bombing. And like the way that they determined, like the way that they locked onto the suspects was they watched all the like hidden camera, CC camera footage throughout the city of like, okay, the moment that the bombing happens, it's like everybody turns their head except the guy who set the bomb. It's like everybody in the whole city turns around except the one dude. And it's like, okay, we got to find out who this dude is. So I think there's something to that.
But they also, there's more to it. Like they concoct this idea that not even 100% clear exactly what their theory is. Like the wife is partially buried there or buried up and down because it's not grave sized. And like they have like this photo thing that's like, I guess, an undeveloped reel that you can kind of like, there's this little tool that you can kind of see an undeveloped reel. And, oh, if you look at this one and this one, doesn't it look like the plant's a little smaller in the original? So it must mean that he dug it up and buried his wife there. And I was like, you're kind of stretching this, buddy.
Buried a part of her in the flower bed. Yeah, why did he do that with just part? Kind of strange. Because he made all those trips with the suitcase to, like, the river or whatever. So, an odd way of going about this.
At the same time, like, it sweeps you up.
Yeah, oh yeah. You're like, all right,
you're like, oh,
let's go.
Yeah. Like, oh yeah, like the flower bed is definitely suspicious. Like, he didn't come to the window. He definitely killed the dog. Might have just been annoyed by the dog just going up and down the.
I know, yeah, that too. It's a yippy dog, yeah.
Thorwald unbound. He's not going to take shit from anybody anymore.
now they're doing their own investigation. So they send Lisa and they send Stella out to go do some investigation. So now we're seeing Lisa and Stella out there in that space that we previously, I don't think, had seen them at all out there, like out in the courtyard in the other apartments. And so we're kind of watching them. Now they're like, the movie is merging with them, the audience too. So, oh, and another thing that they do that this I think is also really important is they write a note to Thorwald and they leave it in his apartment and they call Thorwald. They're like harassing him at this point. They're like writing him notes and giving him calls and saying, we know what you did. You killed someone. And like, again, if you view this from the perspective of like, they're just crazies, there's a potential reading of this film that they've invented everything in their head. And like, he's just a guy who maybe he, I don't know, broke up with his wife or something, and like these people are bothering him. And because it goes further, because they're like, oh, let's go look in the flower bed. And so Stella and Lisa go out into the flower bed and start digging in there. And now Lisa, like, this wasn't part of their plan, but in the spur of the moment, like, climbs up. Almost, I was thinking of like, I watched some old French serials, like they have like hidden places and ways of sneaking into buildings and stuff. And she like almost comically climbs up the wall and into Thorwald's apartment. And but it's very suspenseful because now Thorwald comes back home while she's still in the apartment and he can't do anything. He's the audience. He can't, it's like, no, don't go in. You're going in the wrong room. I was thinking of like, it's the cliche of being a horror movie fan. Don't open that door. What are you doing? And just very, very, I actually had to pause it this time. I was like so suspenseful. Like I'm very tense that she's going to be caught by Thorwald. I'm swept up in it too, you know?
But what also had me almost laughing out loud is that, remember, he said that Lisa is not going to thrive in dangerous situations. She can't do action-packed things, and now suddenly she is, and he's like turned on.
Oh, totally. Like, yeah, I love, like, notice the look that he gives her after she comes back. It's the most excited, like, aroused, in love look he's ever had.
That's funny. And not, yeah, she's like a good detective too. So they have like a key part of their theory is like, well, he would have taken her jewelry if he killed her so that he could sell it or something like that. But they're like, go look for the wedding ring. If we see the wedding ring, that means he killed her. Which I didn't totally follow exactly what their reasoning was about why this wedding ring was so important. But sure enough, she finds the wedding ring. And not only that, but she very covertly slips it on her finger so that it's kind of hidden from Thorwald when Thorwald approaches her in Thorwald's apartment. By the way, he just like went into his apartment and there's a random woman in his apartment.
Well, I think the idea about the ring is if the story is that the wife is just on a trip somewhere else, the idea is that she wouldn't have gone not wearing her ring.
Okay, gotcha.
So if the ring is just hanging out in the apartment, that doesn't make sense.
So that kind of refutes what Doyle's theory was that she's just on a trip. Okay. Right. So that is an important piece of evidence.
Yeah, I think Lisa makes some comment about, like a woman's not going to go on a trip and not bring XYZ, including the wedding ring.
Yeah, there's some interesting, like, they kind of apply their own, I don't know if baggage is the right word, but their own, like, viewpoint of gender roles when they're doing this deductive work and, like, thinking about what a woman would do and what a man would do, etc. But this is like my favorite little segment, at least rewatching it this time, was when she is kind of hiding the ring and the police come in. So I forget which one of them. Is it Thorwald that calls the police or is it Jeff that calls the police? I think it's Jeff that calls the police, right? So go to Thorwald's. And so they go there and Thorwald explains, she broke into my house. And so they actually arrest Lisa. But Thorwald catches a glimpse of the ring that Lisa has kind of stolen, and he turns and looks up at Jeff. And we're kind of seeing this from the perspective of Jeff looking through his lens. And so Thorwald, in fact, looks directly at the audience. And it's like a jump scare. It's like such an incredible image. It's like the threshold is broken. The villain has entered our world. We are in danger now. It's a great moment.
It's awesome. It's the first time anyone has looked directly at Jeff.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I guess except for the people in his apartment, but from like outside of the apartment in.
Right. From one of the other.
And so now, like, the kind of vicarious danger of like living through this danger of the other lives now has just turned on its head, and now, we're in danger. Like, this wasn't just like an empty thrill of watching and enjoying this mystery. It's like, we are the ones who could die from all of this, you know, because we see it directly from his view. And so now we get this just tremendously suspenseful and wonderfully constructed climax here, where Thorwald sneaks up to the apartment, to Jeff's apartment. He physically goes to Jeff's apartment. The whole thing, this whole time, Jeff can't leave his space, but Thorwald can. We know he can leave and come. And so we hear footsteps. And we're watching Jimmy Stewart being like, wait, am I imagining things? Have I been crazy this whole time? Or is in fact my theory coming true? Is in fact Thorwald a killer? Is he coming up to face me now? Footstep. And we see just the frame of his door, and then a shadow cuts off the light of his door, and the door slowly opens, and we just see Thorwald's eyes, but it's unmistakably him. Really a tremendous sequence. And then from there, I don't remember exactly what the questions are, like the things that Thorwald says, but the things that he says, I was thinking about it, are again kind of ambiguous. He doesn't say, I killed her and I'm going to kill you.
And you could argue that they're all reasonable. He's like, what do you want from me? Like, why are you messing in my life, essentially? Who are you?
Where's the ring? Can I get my wife's jewelry back, you know?
Right.
Yeah, I feel like Thorwald could have played this whole thing a little cooler and maybe made it out.
Right.
Like, yeah. When Grace Kelly was in his apartment, he immediately starts slapping her around. And it's like, did you have to do that? Just be like, there's a mysterious woman in my apartment. I didn't invite her here.
What are you doing here? Yeah.
And then immediately he tromps across the way to kill Jimmy Stewart. And it's like, that seems extreme.
Yeah, or at least I yell at him. Yeah. But if you take yourself in the head of Thorwald, like setting aside that it seems like he actually did commit this murder. Like, he's a grumpy guy who has been aggrieved. Like, he's gotten threatening phone calls, like blackmail, and this guy's like spying in on his apartment. And like, I would also kind of empathize with him wanting to defuse this thing and feeling like he's the one who's been harassed. He's the victim in this case. It's very clever.
I think his first question is, what do you want from me? Which I think is a completely reasonable question.
But also the kind of thing that you could like apply to whatever thematic reading you want on there. Oh, is this about movie making? What do you want from me, the character in the story, me, the subject of the film? Or maybe a projection of his mind, a projection of Jeff's at like what he could become if this relationship with Lisa went sour. What do you want from me, the sad married man? Like, what do you want me to tell you about your future? Like, I don't know. I feel like that's just such a open-ended and almost loaded question, you know?
Absolutely. And I think that also fits with when Thorwald is first in his apartment, goes inside, closes the door. The next time we see Jeff in his wheelchair, it's at a bit of a distance, and his face is entirely in shadow. You can't make out any details of his face at all. It's entirely dark in shadow.
Mm-hmm.
Which to me, again, sort of suggests that, like, now that Thorwald is in the room, like that's sort of the manifestation of Jeff, the alternate dark side of
like
Jeff.
They're mirror images of each other. Like, it's that thing has come to life. Yeah, that's kind of interesting. But so Thorwald starts stepping towards Jeff, approaching him, and what is Jeff's defense but flashbulbs from his camera, which to me really hammers home like this is about the way that we consume stories theme, which again, I don't think it's at all the only thing, but this idea that like the way that he deals with these demons, these complex thoughts, this darkness is by like literally flash photography, definitely aligns with that. And it's shot very interestingly because the flashbulb, remember, it's dark in there, like Nate said, it like causes like we see it from Thorwald's perspective, like it causes a blur, and like then it like kind of becomes sharp again, but every time the flash goes off it kind of throws him off and disorients him.
and it dissolves into a pool of red light each time.
But eventually Thorwald gets to him and starts strangling him and wrestling with him and kind of almost throws him out the window, like wrestles him out of the window. And again, this is another fascinating disruption of space that we've had because, you know, this third act here, we've really seen the proscenium dissolve. The movie subject has become the observer and vice versa. And now he's actually thrown out of the window. That was the screen through which he viewed all of this, and he's dangling there. And just in time, neighbors run in and save Jeff. So we also have this theme of like, we shouldn't just creepily peer into other people's lives, but like connect with each other. So they run over there and they save him, and Thorwald gets arrested. But it's just in time. And so that's kind of how the climax goes is like, you're right, Brian. Thorwald brought this on himself. He didn't need to go and do this. If you're thinking about it from his perspective, like, yeah, okay, going and like almost strangling this guy and throwing him out a window is not going to help your case. But like almost immediately we hear the police arrest him. They're like, he's telling us where to go check in the river, basically admitting that he went and dumped the bodies. I thought it was almost comical, like how quick Thorwald apparently admitted to the crime.
And that they checked the flower bed and found, well, there wasn't anything in the flower bed because after the disturbance with the dog, I guess he had dug it up. But whatever part of the body was in there fits in a hat box, they say. So it's kind of like a what's in the box 7 moment here at the end.
And so then we get the denouement. Ever since Gavin corrected my pronunciation, I've been trying to throw that one in whenever I can. The denouement, the following action.
One of my favorite parts is that last brief little scene. I'll let you.
Yeah, so the weather has cooled down. We see the thermometer. So both literally and spiritually, things are stable, calmer, and more comfortable. We see Lisa with Jeff, and I don't know, it's a very short scene, so we don't get too much from it. But first of all, he's got 2 casts. So both of his legs from the fall, like dangling, and he fell down, that apparently broke his other leg too. And second, we see Lisa. She's still like Grace Kelly, very pretty, but she's kind of dressed more casually and kind of lounging with him, and she's like reading a travel magazine. Although when he dozes off, she puts the travel magazine and pulls out a fashion magazine. And that's how the movie ends, with them together. So what do you like about this ending here, Nate?
Well, I think for so much of the movie, the idea is that Jeff was trying to sort of live in his fantasy world and his dream world instead of just actually live his life and focus on what was literally right in front of him, usually in the presence of Lisa. And so we understand here, even though he's literally asleep in this final scene, we can still just sort of understand, just from the context and expressions on their faces and everything, that he's, and the way he's facing, that he's done living in that fantasy world, and he's content and happy with his life and with what's in front of him, and that he's actually awake.
Asleep. Yeah, it's like that's funny.
Yeah. And then I love Lisa, like when she sees he's asleep, pulling out her actual fashion magazine.
Right. They've met in the middle. They're still themselves, but they've met in the middle. Yeah.
I'm right. I'm still myself, but right. But she also proved herself during the whole ordeal, and the whole thing brought them together. But she's not gonna completely disregard who she is.
But also there's closure on all the little arcs with all the dollhouse people. That we see the Miss Torso is actually in a relationship with like Wally Cox, some dorky guy who has been away in the army. And then what else do we see?
Oh, Miss Lonely Hearts
hooks up with the songwriter.
Falls in love with the songwriter, right?
Yeah.
We see the newlyweds. Maybe they weren't newlyweds, because don't we see them in their wedding stuff, or is it a different couple? I feel like we see a wedding couple too.
Yeah, they were definitely newlyweds at the start of the story, because he carries her across the threshold.
Gotcha. Yeah. I also, another thing I liked about this ending bit is the image of both of the legs broken, he's kind of got balance and symmetry now. And it also kind of transforms the the broken leg was like the source of his impotence, but it's also kind of like a phallic symbol. And so he's kind of like gone from having his one droopy leg next to his big hefty cast to like, that's kind of, he's kind of found power in that as well. It's kind of like a double edge, like it's a twisted version of it. Kind of like you were saying with the he's asleep, but he's awake. He's powerful and found himself, but also he's like more hobbled than he was,
Absolutely. And, he spent the whole movie wishing he could get out of his cast and, counting down the hours until he could get it off. And now he has another cast, and yet he doesn't care and he's happy because everything with Lisa has been
right
put into its place.
And then the window shade closes, and that is Rear Window. Now, is 1954, is that right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to pull up his chronological filmography here. So this was the first, so this came after Strangers on a Train, after Dial M for Murder, but then before To Catch a Thief, before The Man Who Knew Too Much, and then that stretch where he had Vertigo, North by Northwest, Psycho, and then the ones that were a little more divisive after that, The Birds and Marnie, Torn Curtain. But this kind of was as he was kind of ascending to those most acclaimed films. Psycho in 1960, yeah.
Yeah, if you just look at that stretch of like 6-7 years, mid to late 50s up through Psycho, I mean, it's amazing.
Pretty crazy, yeah.
I'm not sure it's ever been matched by anybody, frankly.
So why don't we go ahead and rate the movie, and then we can do our Hitchcock ratings? Because I also feel like if we did our rankings before we did our ratings, it might spoil what score we're going to give this film. But Brian, did you have any other thoughts you wanted to throw in there before we rated?
Just that I agree with your assessment earlier that rewatching it makes it even stronger. It's like all the parts are there for a reason, or seem to be, even if it's like complicating the discourse.
Right. Yeah, making it less of a simple, elegant watching object, but it kind of adds heft to it, especially on rewatch, yeah. So Is It Good is our signature section where we each give the movie a rating on our 8-point goodness scale, ranging from very not good, which is a 1 out of 8, to our masterpiece rating, toward a good, which is an 8 out of 8. Brian, you can go first. Is Rear Window from 1954 by Alfred Hitchcock good?
It's really good. There's a lot of strong elements to it. I really, really like the production design, just this whole setup of the courtyard and all the various apartments and how it can all be controlled by the filmmakers. I'm going to give it a high 7 out of 8. Exceptionally good. It loses just a little bit for me because the protagonist is right away. And there is some drama to be had in kind of sussing out, well, is it? Or is he just, I don't know, prejudice against Swedish immigrants or whatever ethnicity Thorwald is? But it's like, yeah, he was right all along immediately. What he thought was correct. And all the efforts to complicate it, it's like, no, he had it. But I like that, as Nate said, it's not all about the murder drama. Like, what's really key is the relationship between Jimmy Stewart and Grace Kelly, and then also somewhat the connections between this community, because it's not true that everybody is actually isolated and an island unto themselves. There really is such a thing as community, and it pulls your heartstrings in a way that is almost like, I don't know, It's a Wonderful Life or something. It's like when that happened and the glass broke and everybody was united, it's like, oh, I'm feeling something. So how are you feeling, Nate?
It's an 8 out of 8 for me. I mean, it's one of my all-time favorite movies. I've probably said most of what I want to say. I just think it's such a cool way to tell a story of this couple coming together and this man facing his demons and his fears about commitment. it's such a clever way to tell that kind of a story. And everything else we've talked about, it's one of my all-time favorites.
So the first time I watched Rear Window, I would have given it a 7 out of 8. In fact, I think I did on Letterboxd. And even halfway through the second time watching it, I was like, I'm ready for this movie to really wow me. And then for whatever reason, I really felt the way it came together in the third act, and like the stuff about the revelation pacing and like the purpose of the lieutenant character to kind of pour water on the intrigue really came into more of a strength than a weakness, because it kind of, I don't know, just reshapes like how you think about the story as the viewer and like what it says about the characters and stuff. And me like not being concerned about what happened, because I actually did not know when it first started whether there was going to end up being a murder the first time through, because I had seen the Simpsons thing, but I was like, is that doing the beat or is that making fun of the beat? And I pieced together there probably would be by like around the middle point, because I was like, this would be less interesting if there just straight up wasn't a murder, you know? But I kind of like the ambiguity and the different ways you can view it, and just the many, many layers of the themes, like different ways you can think about this. Like, oh, really? This kind of is telling you something about blank, about being a movie fan, about being a movie director, about being like a weird person who's kind of obsessed with peeping into other people's lives, being a voyeur. But also just like about this main character and his relationship. And it also strikes me, like you said, Nate, that this is just a unique way of telling a story. It's like it's never really been done in quite the same way, or at least it hadn't been. But now, like, you could have TV shows or stories like, quote unquote, doing a Rear Window. Like you could be doing an It's a Wonderful Life, means you experience what it would be like if the person was never born, or doing a Groundhog Day is going through a time loop. Or I don't know, like it almost such perfected this concept that like the idea of someone piecing together partial information through being secluded in a space, looking out in the world, is like a story format in and of itself that this movie practically invented and perfected. And I just think it's very rich, and it's very intriguing and suspenseful more than anything else at the right moments. And great characters, like the characters really stand out. They're all kind of distinct. It's ambivalent in its themes. It doesn't fully go one way or fully go the other way in terms of like condemning you, the audience, or its characters, but also not letting you off or the characters off the hook either. I think it's a masterpiece. I am bumping my 7 out of 8 for my first viewing up to an 8 out of 8. This is for me a masterpiece film. And so now let's talk about where we place these among our Hitchcock rankings overall. So for me, my top 4, now keeping in mind, I still have some to see that I'm very excited to see. I haven't seen Notorious, for example, but my top 4 right now, I would have Vertigo at number 1. I actually think this inches past Psycho for number 2 for me. Psycho at number 3, and North by Northwest. And all 4 are either masterpieces or like right on the edge of masterpieces, I would say. But I have this at number 2 for me, right behind Vertigo right now. But what about you, Nate?
All right. I like that. I mean, I can't really argue with any of those. My top 5 in some order is those plus Notorious.
Okay.
So I think my top 2 in some order are this and North by Northwest.
Okay.
And they're pretty close. I think I told you I just rewatched North by Northwest again, and I absolutely loved it, and I want to go watch it again.
It's such a fun one, yeah.
It's just so good. So to me, those like this and that one are a little bit above the rest, and then in some order, Vertigo, Notorious, and Psycho.
Cool.
Are next. Definitely watch Notorious.
Is Psycho your favorite, Brian?
So I need to watch a lot more, obviously, and North by Northwest I should watch again, because that was a long time ago that I did see North by Northwest. This is quite a good one. Probably of what I've seen, Psycho is my favorite. I like the twists and turns of that, and it's got that Bernard Herrmann score. The next one that I want to see is Vertigo. Also, I've never seen The Birds, so there's gaps that need to be filled before I make an official list. But what I've seen, I've enjoyed. I would recommend Rope if you haven't seen that one, Dan. That was like a very minimalist. It all takes place in one room, basically. Kind of similar to this one, but like even more so because it's all set up with the illusion that it's a single shot.
You mentioned Herman as the composer. Is that his name of Psycho? Bernard Herrmann, is that right?
I believe so. Also did score work on The Twilight Zone.
The score in Vertigo is one of the best I've ever heard. It's so good. And watching Vertigo and Psycho back to back, I was like, hold up, is like Bernard Herrmann the greatest composer in the history of cinema? Like, because they're both of them are that good. But so I guess the credited composer on Rear Window is Franz Waxman. But again, we get most of that through the songwriter, you know, just hearing him play piano. And then I guess if I had to pick a fifth one, I would probably go with The Lady Vanishes among the ones I've seen. But I would say spot number 5 is pretty highly up for grabs right now.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many out there. Like, I mean, I'll give a quick shout out to Dial M for Murder.
Okay.
Which I like maybe more than a lot of people. Also takes place almost entirely in one location. I'll also give a shout out to Catch a Thief, which is totally light and fluffy and not particularly intense.
Okay.
But it's a lot of fun. And also has Grace Kelly. So there you go. It all comes full circle.
Cool. Well, this was really fun. I'm glad we got to talk through Hitchcock. I'm glad I understand and appreciate Rear Window more than I did the first time through. Yeah. Brian, anything interesting going on with you? We're about to go into Christmas break week.
Yeah, we're getting close. I don't know. Watched some good things. I have been rewatching Lord of the Rings lately, and who knows, the next time we have Will on, we might talk about that.
Definitely. But
what about you? How are the holidays treating you, Dan?
I've been crazy busy with holidays, and then I'm in a project at work that's just always escalating. And I also have been trying to catch up on some of the acclaimed films from 2024 by the time the year wraps, so I can do my rankings of the year and my award nominations, since I'm a voting member of an award body now. Actually, a couple technically. And I really want to have a top 10 of the first half of the decade, or rather my 10 favorites. And I have 8 that I feel pretty good about, but I'm hoping to find 2 movies that I can round out my top 10 of the first half of the 2020s, depending on how you break it down, because I tend to think of it decades like when the tens digit flips, which is not what the Gregorian calendar is. So like there's always debate about, oh, when is the decade half over? Oh, when are we in the new decade? I just like 90s means anything to start with 90, you know? And so then 20s is anything that starts with a 2. So we'd be halfway done at the end of this year. But yeah, so Nate, we'll have to have you on again sometime. Brian, I think what I'm going to have us watch is I want to talk about Paul Feig. Do you know who Paul Feig is?
Yeah, he did Bridesmaids, right?
Yeah, and he's done a bunch of interesting stuff. And he had a movie this year that just completely belly flopped with critics called Jackpot. But that's not what I want to talk about. Since it's Christmas time, I want to talk about, he's got some sort of like weird time travel Christmas movie or something called Last Christmas. And I've heard mixed things about this.
Oh.
Tilting negative.
I watched that last year not really knowing what to expect. Yeah, I won't give anything away.
So I want to watch and discuss Last Christmas from 2019, directed by Paul Feig. So I think that'll be an interesting one.
All right, sounds fun.
Nate, is there anything you want to pitch or tell us what you've been watching?
No, I'll just stick with the Hitchcock. I'll stick with the Rear Window. This was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me on. Glad we were able to talk about one of my favorites.
Cool. All right, everybody, have a good one and happy holidays.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for tuning in.